A few days after the San Marino Grand Prix, the Zambian football team was en route to a World Cup qualifier in Senegal when its aircraft, a DHC Buffalo operated by the Zambian Air Force, crashed in the ocean off Gabon, not long after taking off from a refuelling stop at the capital Libreville. Investigations showed that the port engine had caught fire, but that the pilot, fatigued from having flown the team home from Mauritius just the previous day and responding to a faulty indicator light, shut down the starboard engine. Everyone on the plane, 5 crew and 25 players and team staff were killed. While Zambia had never been a successful team, the current crop were regarded as highly promising after a 4-0 thumping of Italy at the 1988 Olympics, a hat-trick from captain Kalusha Bwalya earning him African Footballer of the Year, and had finished third in the Africa Cup of Nations in 1990. A shattered team was rebuilt around a few star players, including Bwalya, who were playing in Europe and had been travelling separately, and gave a good account of themselves, only missing out on qualifying for their first World Cup thanks to a 1-0 defeat by Morocco in the last game, and making it to the final of the 1994 Africa Cup of Nations before succumbing to Nigeria in the final. In 2012, a new generation of Zambian players won the Africa Cup of Nations, defeating Côte d'Ivoire on penalties in Libreville, Gabon, not far from the site of that 1993 crash. Paraguay held its first full free elections, 4 years after the overthrow of long-term dictator Alfredo Stroessner. A snap election back in 1989 had been more or less freely contested, with Lieutenant General Andrés Rodriguez confirmed as Stroessner's successor to complete his term, but in 1993 for the first time there were no military candidates and more than 2 parties. The conservative National Republic Association, universally known as the Colorados, still won, and leader Juan Carlos Wasmosi was elected president, but would form a minority government, with the authentic radical liberals polling about a third of the vote and winning 17 Senate seats and 33 deputies, to the Colorados 20 and 38 respectively. Coming up on the rails was a new party, founded in 1991, the Encuentro Nacional, with just under a quarter of the vote, and between them the 2 opposition parties had a majority over the government if they needed it. US election observers, headed by former US President Jimmy Carter, noted that the election hadn't gone off entirely without violence, but that the result itself seemed sufficient evidence that there hadn't at least been widespread cheating. Another IRA bomb exploded in England, this time in Bishopsgate in London's financial district near Liverpool Street Station. Unlike the previous attack in Warrington, a warning was telephoned in good time, about an hour in advance, and the bomb was set on a Sunday, when the financial district was quiet anyway. 44 were injured, but only 1 killed, a news photographer covering the expected blast. Liverpool Street Station and the nearby NatWest Tower, now Tower 42, were heavily damaged, and the tiny medieval, and uninsured, St Ethelburga the Virgin Church just 7 metres from the bomb was almost destroyed. Rather than paying the estimated £350 million bill to restore it, some within the Church of England wanted to demolish the remains and sell off the now incredibly valuable land, but in the end, at the urging of the Bishop of London, it was restored to its original exterior plan and reopened in 2002 to become St Ethelburga's Centre for Reconciliation and Peace. It was Indy 500 time in the US. 6 previous winners on the entry list in the shapes of Al Unser's Senior and Junior, Danny Sullivan, Emerson Fittipaldi, Ari Luyendyk and Mario Andretti, while there was a strong rookie contingent including Nelson Piquet, Stefan Johansson, Robbie Gordon and, of course, Nigel Mansell, who was hogging most of the headlines, at least until 1992 IndyCar champion Bobby Rahal found himself bumped from the starting grid, having just not got his car set up right. The front row was made up of Luyendyk, Andretti and Raul Boesel, with Mansell on row 3 between the 2 Penske's. Boesel got the best start and led the initial laps until a controversial stop-go penalty dropped him to the rear of the field, and for most of the race it was between Fittipaldi, Mansell and Luyendyk. When Linson James caused the yellow flag on lap 182, they were right together with Mansell leading, and when the restart came, both Emo and Ari got past. In his attempts to pursue them, Nigel brushed the wall but got away with it to come home third, as Fittipaldi won his second Indy 500, while Raul Boesel came fourth after a fine comeback, but was incandescent about the penalty that he felt had cost him the race. Emo caused further controversy by refusing the traditional pint of milk offered to the winner, preferring his own brand of orange juice.
No, I'm not having the milk, sir.
Yeah! Put that freak on!
Now there's a first.
Emerson, you're not going to drink the milk.
Well, I'm going to drink the orange juice. That's my producing, and I'm going to have this time orange juice. I produce orange juice.
Back in Sao Paulo, Brazil, he produces the orange juice, so he's going to go that way.
Mansell was Rookie of the Year, the first rookie since 1970 to go the full 500 miles, and still led the championship by 7 points going into the next round at Milwaukee, all of which made the rumours circulating in the F1 paddock that Benetton were trying to bring Mansell in to replace Riccardo Patrese for the rest of the year seem somewhat unlikely, however breathlessly the British media were reporting it. More believable were the rumours that several teams were courting him for 1994, but that was a long way off yet. The F1 transporters rolled into Barcelona for the Spanish Grand Prix, and finally the saga of Ayrton Senna's contract appeared to be over, as the Brazilian champion was reported to have come to an agreement with Ron Dennis for the remainder of the season. Senna's agent, Julian Jacobi, stressed that there was nothing yet in writing, though, while the scuttlebutt in the paddock was that Ayrton would be getting an eye-watering $1 million per race for the rest of the year. More interestingly, though, Jacobi had been seen talking to Frank Williams and Patrick Head in England. Apparently Senna had not yet given up on the Williams drive for next year, but that might depend on Renault, who would no doubt continue to prefer Prost. Senna's commitment was also good news for Michael Andretti. The American was already coming under pressure from Ron Dennis after failing to finish so far, but Senna was known to be very supportive of him and was keen to help him out with advice, which seemed something of a departure for the normally hyper-competitive Ayrton. Cynics suggested he thought Michael was less of a threat to him than Mika Häkkinen, still kicking his heels and waiting for his chance, might be. Despite the upcoming FISA meeting in June to discuss the 1994 regulations, many, notably Ferrari, were getting very impatient, unable to really do any development before it was known what the rules would be, especially as the mooted changes would make a huge difference. Max Mosley remained a hardliner on the subject of driver aids, wanting to ban active suspension, traction and launch control, ABS brakes, real-time telemetry and even semi-automatic gearboxes. The richer teams, Williams, McLaren and Ferrari particularly, were still implacably opposed, suggesting instead that active ride, telemetry and the semi-automatic gearboxes at least approved for one more year. They were supported by their technical partners/customers, Ligier Footwork and Scuderia Italia respectively, while in the anti-electronics corner were Flavio Briatore, Ken Tyrrell and Eddie Jordan, among others. There were continued and increasingly bad-tempered discussions over the weekend in Barcelona, with accusations that Max Mosley was assuming dictatorial powers and planning to break the Concord Agreement, which would require unanimity from the teams. One reason Ferrari was so keen to get this sorted, of course, was that their 1993 had been, so far, absolutely catastrophic. To their unwanted record of 38 races without a win, they could now add their worst first 4 races in the entire history of the championship. They could at least announce Alesi's contract extension, which would see him at Maranello until the end of 1995, and internal sources said that this also saw him given equal status with Berger, who had at least unofficially been made number 1 in 1993, given his greater experience and previous history with the team. Gerhardt had been notably off Jean's pace so far, and grumpily claimed the F93A was the worst car he'd ever driven, which, considering he'd started his career at ATS, was quite a claim. Luca di Montezemolo, for his part, had Giancarlo Minardi over for lunch and a factory tour, and as Giancarlo gleefully revealed, asked as he was leaving, "So, Giancarlo, got any tips about scoring points?" The Minardis arrived in Spain sporting McLaren-style barge boards, while elsewhere the Lolas had already had some development in the suspension and rear wing area. Jordan had now produced a new enlarged monocoque for Boutsen that would fit him better, while Tyrrell had, with a deep sigh, postponed the introduction of the new 021 chassis, so the 1990 vintage 020 would live to race another day. Prost had tested a new fly-by-wire throttle during post-race tests at Imola, though the team opted not to use it in Spain, while Gerhard Berger and Nicola Larini had been putting in the miles at Mugello to develop a new gas spring active suspension. Alesi, for his part, would race with the existing version, which was at least a bit more reliable, even if it didn't work as well. In just its 3rd year of use, the Circuit de Catalunya was already showing signs of wear and tear, with the circuit having become very bumpy, and anyone with active suspension would be at a distinct advantage. And so it proved. Prost was completely dominant across both days of qualifying, while Hill finished Friday 3rd behind Senna, before holding provisional pole for most of Saturday, until Prost dug deep and produced a 1:17.8 to take his 25th career pole by half a second. Senna was third, nearly 2 full seconds off Prost, and vocal about his disenchantment with being so far off the Williamses. Schumacher was another 8/10ths behind Senna in fourth, suffering a lack of grip, and only 8/100ths ahead of Patrese, who seemed to have found the measure of his Benetton. Another fine qualifying performance from Wendlinger put the Sauber 6th, and he would be hoping to convert that into points this time. Once again, Michael Andretti was right with Wendlinger, having struggled to get his McLaren set up right, and would start alongside Alesi, with Leto 9th and Herbert 10th, his best qualifying so far this year. Berger started back in 11th, alongside Mark Blundell. Both Ligier drivers were down with the flu, Martin down in 16th, with the Larousses improving to 13th and 14th after a dreadful Friday session. The Footwork's new engine was still a little fragile, so they were well down, as were the oversteering Jordans. And missing out once again would be Alboreto, after Badoer put in a heroic performance to qualify 22nd, while Barbazza was at the back again, hoping to repeat his Imola success from there. Johnny Herbert's suspension went into overdrive while he was sitting on the dummy grid, bouncing the Lotus up and down while stationary, but after a bit of fettling by the Lotus mechanics he was able to get away before everyone else came back round to line up, so he would be able to start from the grid, albeit from the back. The sun was out, and for the first time in 1993, no rain was forecast. The red lights came on, then turned flashing orange. Something had gone wrong somewhere, but they all tore off the line anyway, with Prost's gearbox taking a moment to find a gear and delaying him slightly, allowing Hill past into turn 1, with Senna trying to follow in his slipstream, but Prost braved it out round the outside and held the place. Wendlinger meanwhile had a dreadful start and dropped to 11th, with Hill leading from Prost, Senna, Schumacher, Patrese, Andretti, Alesi, Leto, Berger and Alio in the top 10 at the end of lap 1. Hill and Prost were already pulling away from Senna, who had Schumacher tucked up under his rear wing, and Katayama went off sideways but kept it going to bounce across the runoff area and get back on the track, coming in to have it checked over as Herbert came in to retire, his suspension still all over the place. Turned out it was a loose wire.
Johnny, after that superb qualifying, 10th on the grid, you didn't even manage to leave the grid on the proper start. What happened?
You spoke to me before the race.
As the opening laps played out, Prost seemed happy for now to stay a second behind his teammate and a second ahead of Senna, and indeed the McLaren seemed to have stabilised the gap already, rather than seeing the Williamses march off into the distance. The gap was still extending, but only by a little, while Zanardi and Wendlinger were having a great scrap further back over 12th, which Wendlinger took when Zanardi ran wide. Gradually, though, Senna had fallen back to about 3 seconds behind Prost, while staying 2 seconds ahead of Schumacher, whose gearbox kept shifting straight from third down to first, which wasn't helping. Prost, meanwhile, had been hanging on to Hill's rear wing, and on lap 11 he pulled out at the end of the long straight and went past without any drama, quickly pulling out a lead of about a second. Martin Brundle seemed to lock everything up and go into the gravel. In fact, he'd had a right rear puncture so slow his onboard computer hadn't picked it up until he suddenly lost grip. Disappointing for Martin after his podium at Imola, but also possibly a relief as he sweated with the flu. The leaders were already coming up to lap the first of the stragglers, Barbazza, Fittipaldi and De Cesaris, none of whom posed any problem for either Williams driver. In fact, Prost continued setting fastest laps as he wove through the traffic, with Hill keeping station about 2 seconds behind, and Senna now 6 seconds behind the Englishman. 2 more Englishmen, Blundell and Warwick, were having their own battle, and Derek held Prost up for nearly a whole lap, which allowed Hill to regain some ground as the race hit 1/3 distance, and the pair continued to make their way through the field. As Prost passed Wendlinger, Hill had a look, clearly keen to at least give his team leader a good race. They all passed a stationary Katayama, who damaged his suspension with his earlier off and lost 10 laps in the pits for getting it fixed, only for it to break again. Warwick had a spin of his own at Wörth, the same place where Katayama had gone off, but was able to keep it running and rejoin, while despite still setting fastest laps, Prost was finding the handling of his Williams becoming more problematic. One of his wheels had come a bit loose, which is why he was having so much trouble keeping Hill behind him. Behind them, Senna nearly got taken out by 8th placed Eric Comas as he lapped the Larousse. There would no doubt be words later. Berger came in for new tyres on lap 31. No stops were expected, but his active suspension was proving to increase wear, and Gerhard was always hard on tyres anyway, so he dropped down to 15th as the leaders now started lapping the tail-enders for the second time at half distance. With not much having changed in the top 6, the order remained Prost, Hill, Senna, Schumacher, Patrese and Andretti, with Alesi and Leto both now a lap down fighting over 7th, and Wendlinger and Comas behind them, the Austrian having moved past the Frenchman in Senna's wake. Alain and Damon were still driving in close formation, swapping fastest laps as Schumacher also dived in for tyres, retaining his 4th place, now just ahead of his teammate. His gearbox trouble had, it seemed, been erased by a vibration in his tyres, causing it to jump, so he'd popped in to see if changing them would help. So it was 2 Williamses running nose to tail, then Senna's McLaren, then 2 Benettons running nose to tail, then the other McLaren. Patrese had been looking much better in the Benetton all weekend, having seemingly finally got to grips with the car. His fellow Italian veteran De Cesaris was having less luck, pulling over on the pit straight when his engine electronics went out, and he was pushed through the sliding gap in the pit wall and straight into the garage, and yet another Italian, Barbazza, tried a move on Badoer and ended up in the gravel trap. The Tyrrell mechanics actually restarted De Cesaris' car and sent it back out, only for it to be black flagged a few laps later. And then Hill was cruising into the pits to retire, his Renault V10 trailing smoke, at almost exactly 2/3 distance, and Jean Alesi's Ferrari V12 detonated in sympathy shortly afterwards. So it was Prost, Senna, Schumacher, Patrese, Andretti, Leto, while Warwick came in after having had another spin to change his gravel-encrusted tyres. Schumacher by now was flying, breaking the lap record on his fresher tyres, but Senna still had time to pit, be delayed by a left rear problem, and get out in second, albeit now only 4 seconds ahead of the German, who had finally shaken off Patrese, the Italian, with Prost now in his mirrors. Leto dropped out of 6th with a blown engine, putting Comas into the points, while the McLaren team had looked at Senna's tyres, found them to be much more hard-won than expected, and brought Andretti in too, just in case. He had plenty of time to get in and out with a slick stop without losing 5th. Senna had responded to Schumacher's charge by speeding up, but the Benetton closed up when Suzuki got in Senna's way, and getting past the footwork quickly himself, Schumacher had now closed to within 3.5 seconds and was still going faster and faster, keen to win the duel of the Ford V8s. With just 5 laps to go, only a catastrophic mechanical failure could stop Prost taking the win, while Comas had lost a potential point when his oil pressure started to drop and he slowed up, so a 3-way scrap between Zanardi, Blundell and Berger took up the chase for 6th. Senna came up to lap the 3 of them, which held him up a little, allowing Schumacher to close right up, and just then Zanardi's engine blew, spraying oil all over the visors of Senna and Blundell, and dropping some on the track, which saw Schumacher have a brief off-track excursion. No harm done to the car, but Senna was past Berger and now 6th Blundell, while Schumacher had not only been delayed, but now had dirty tyres. And so that was that. Prost cruised home after finally passing Patrese, with Senna 2nd and Schumacher 3rd, Patrese a lap down in 4th, and Andretti taking his first finish and his first points for McLaren, having driven a steady, cautious race with the goal of just finishing. Mark Blundell, not only flu-ridden but wrestling with a poorly handling Ligier and an oil-covered visor, had lost 6th to Berger on the last lap, doubling Ferrari's points tally for the year so far. The footworks both soldiered home 2 and 3 laps adrift respectively, but satisfied to have got a full race distance out of their fragile engines, and the Jordans likewise plugged away to finish 3 laps down, with Boutsen leading his young teammate home. It was the first time that the 2 established stars of F1 racing, Prost and Senna, had shared the podium with the up-and-coming star Michael Schumacher. Prost said afterwards that, thanks to the handling problems he was having, it had actually been one of the most physically draining races he'd driven, and that he didn't think he'd have been able to keep Hill behind him for the entire race. For his part, Damon had said beforehand that, given Williams' dominance, it was the duty of himself and Alain to race each other so the fans had something good to watch, but commentators like James Hunt rather suspected that he was protesting too much, and while he'd had a few looks at Prost, he may well have been under orders to make it look good but stay behind. The rest of the season would tell. Senna also said he was exhausted afterwards and was rather despondent that all he'd really been able to do was follow Prost and hope he broke down, while Schumacher, taking 3rd place in the championship, had had troubles of his own, having to do all the slow corners in 3rd thanks to his gearbox problems. So, Prost regained top spot in the Drivers' Championship, and while Williams had pulled further ahead in the Constructors, Hill's retirement and McLaren's first double points finish of the year meant that it was only by 2 points over last time. Next up, the unforgiving streets of Monaco.